The clink of the windshield shattering still echoed in his head. It was only several seconds after the impact that his brain, swimming in alcohol, realized what had just happened. At that moment, panic began to flare up inside him and put his nervous system on alert. Unfortunately, not in time. Because by the time the heavy Mercedes limousine came to a halt, it was already too late. Even now, hours later, the adrenaline rushing through his bloodstream from the moment of shock was still making his heart pound like it was going to burst. The roaring in his ears was not getting any quieter either. Over and over again, he heard the shattering glass, the dull thud, and his own surprised cry. Even now, in the silence of his bedroom, the sounds inside him almost made him go crazy. Plus, the insipid taste of blood. He had bitten his tongue on impact, and it didn't seem to want to stop bleeding. If that's the least of your problems, he thought. Yes, that was true. If only that was the least of his problems. His wife was lying next to him, and, like so many times before, she hadn't stirred when he had come to bed. In all the years that she had to go to sleep alone, she had developed a talent for not letting herself be disturbed once asleep. Today, he was more than grateful for that. If she would wake up, she would immediately realize that something was wrong. They had become estranged over the years, but she could still read him like a book. The story he had been thinking about for the last few hours was a good one, but he wasn't ready to tell it right away. His mind had to calm down first. At least he thought it was good. But was it true? Had he really thought of everything? He hoped so, but he wasn't 100% sure. He replayed the last few hours over and over again in his mind's eye. If only he had said no to the second glass, preferably the first. But this consideration was no longer important. Right now, it was only important that he survived the situation and didn't ruin his career. He had dedicated his life to this company. He couldn't let it all be for nothing. No, not for 2 lousy gin and tonics, especially now, when he was so close to reaching the next level and finally becoming a partner. So many sleepless nights, all the overtime, all the drinks and small talk he'd had with people he despised. He didn't even like the gin that his future partner handed him with a big grin that he would have liked to smack off his face. He couldn't tell you how much he disgusted him with his little piggy eyes and hanging cheeks that made him look like a fattened animal about to be shot. And yet he had taken the glass and downed the drink sip by sip. What wouldn't you do for a career? But he believed that even if he had refused the drinks, it would have happened. It all happened so quickly and he didn't have time to react. Who would ride a bike at night without lights? On the highway and without a helmet? Who was that stupid? It might even have saved her life if she had been wearing one. He paused and thought. No, it wouldn't have been good if she had survived. It would have only gotten him in more trouble. It was definitely better this way. With trembling knees, he had gotten out of the car and searched the ditch, and there, under her dented bike, she laid. No pulse. The impact must have knocked her lights out immediately. After all, a stroke of luck. He had stood there for a long time thinking about what he should do now, then got back into his Mercedes and drove off. It was the only right thing he could have done. He drove the 150 kilometers home on autopilot while his overwhelmed mind made a plan. Fortunately, it had happened far enough away. But what should he do with the car? The cracked windshield, the dented hood. He knew where he could take the car for repairs. They wouldn't ask any questions, not after what he had done for the mechanic. He was able to convince the judge that the mechanic had not been in town at the time, even though guilt seemed to ooze from every pore of his body. So that wasn't a problem. But what about his wife? She would ask questions, and so would his son. He could tell them he'd had a wildlife accident. But then he would have to inform the police, and he wanted to keep them out of it at all costs. And then, just a few kilometers from his hometown, the solution occurred to him. It was simple and cruel at the same time, and yet the only way out. The big dog's joyful greeting when he arrived home almost tore his heart apart. the excited tail wagging as he reached for the long leash and the happy jumping up and down as the dog thought they were going for a night walk. But instead of going into the woods, he wrapped the leash around the garden fence and told her to sit in the street and stay. She would listen. She was a good dog. And then it happened again, very quickly. Squealing tires and a heavy thud, tears streaming down his cheeks. Even now, as he lay in bed next to his wife, he cried like the little child he felt like at that moment. Oh God, the way her little paw twitched and then the whimpering. He would never be able to forget it again, nor the agonized whimpering that came from his own throat. Why couldn't she have died immediately? Why couldn't she do him this favor? She seemed to look at him questioningly. Her eyes rolled in their sockets, that look she used to give him when she sat next to him at the table and waited for something to fall. And of course he always dropped something, no matter what his wife said. Let her grumble and tell him he would forgive her. He loved the dog, and the dog loved him, which only made what he had had to do that much worse. But he hadn't had any other choice. Had he? No. It was the only way out. He sat next to the animal for an eternity, stroking her fur and waiting for it to end, which it finally did, after an agonizingly long time. His wife would feel guilty when he told her that she probably hadn't closed the gate properly. It would kill her, but he was prepared to accept that. He couldn't lose everything he'd spent years building up now. His story was a good one. The accident hadn't woken any of the neighbors, which was a shame. Witnesses would have been good. But the blood on the street in front of the house spoke for itself. And of course, the dead dog in the garage. It would do. He just had to convince his family, for the time being. But his story would also work if he had to tell it under oath. After all, it was his job to get people out of the mess they had gotten themselves into. Then he would be able to do it for himself. But he didn't think it would come to that. Hopefully, he had thought of everything. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But he wouldn't be able to sleep for a long time.
I am Maggie J, and you're listening to Thrill, Suspense, Crime, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe to my channel for a new story every week.